Hemshech Hayim Beis, we're in the middle of chapter 174, volume 1, page 352. And we're in the middle of discussion of the two dimensions of Torah to explain the interface of Torah as an extension of the discussion of the interface of Ak, Adam Kadmon, that there's an element of Torah that applies itself to existence, and an element of Torah that's beyond existence. Going back to Eir HaBli and Eir HaGvul, the general theme of Hayim Beis so far, which is the transcendent energy and the immanent energy, and the transcendent energy itself, in the Makiv there's where it relates to existence and where it's beyond. And we discussed it in the context of Adam Kadmon, Pnimi Yisak, Chitzeni Yisak, and Torah, which is Chochmah, the wisdom of Adam Kadmon, which has the whole picture, vision of existence. The wisdom is Torah, and Torah also has the klal of Torah, which we spoke was Chsumanit. Now the Torah was given as one entity, one sealed entity, and then there's Megillah, and the Torah is given in a revealed way, stage by stage, specifics, and it applies to the specifics of existence. The Torah talks about different mitzvahs in a timely way, things that happen at particular times. To explain that, he uses David HaMelech, King David's punishment and the critique of King David of calling the Torah Zmiris. Because Zmiris implies the Torah as it relates to him. It helped him get through his troubles and difficulties by realizing that the Torah existence is dependent on one specific of Torah, one digduk, one detail in the Torah. Also Zmira from the word Lazamer Aritzim, which is to uproot the weeds. As we spoke, the two ways, the double-edged sword. Two ways that the klippus nurse or suckle or what's the word we used? Glean their energy. So David HaMelech was focusing on that part of the Torah. And the punishment, nenash, because all that is the outer dimension of Torah. How Torah relates to existence. So the Torah, the way it really is in its pure form, is Shashui Amelech Batzmuseh. It's divine delight. It's something on God's terms. And completely beyond existence. As he explains at length, the difference in inner Torah and outer Torah, and the inner Torah, so even though the outer Torah also has in it that element, but that you reach through Birurim, through the struggle, the exertion in Torah. That Tainagatzmi. I spoke about Noivlis Chochmah Shel Maila Torah, that the Noivlis, which means some call it the shadow, but here it sounds more like that which falls off the tree, like the leaves or the fruits off a tree. So the wisdom below is only Noivlis from that which is above. It's only a sort of outer dimension. Something that fell and is separated from. Okay. And this is the difference in Zmiris and Shira. Shira is without a keli, is singing with peh. Zmiris is with kelim, how it relates to kelim. And that was what David HaMelech did. He spoke about the Torah Zmiris. Not Shira Imei, Belayla Shira Imei, how it's God's song. But he spoke about how it's our song. How it's a human song, which means that the Torah relates and serves existence. That's not the umka pnimiyusa, that's not the depth of the Torah. Which is v'hoya etzle shashui, etzle dafka. Like he brings, all based on Ageres HaKedesh Kunter Sachron, the epistle that begins with this same piece. David Zmiris Karisalahu. In doing my research, the source is obviously Tanya, that Ageres HaKedesh, but that Ageres HaKedesh is elaborated in discourses of the Rebbe Ramarash, which elaborate on that Ageres HaKedesh, and that Ageres HaKedesh also brings the two examples he brought here, the example of Karbonis and Tefillin. Both are from Tanya. There is a similar explanation in Likutei Torah also on this Maimer V'hoya Etzlei Amen in Bamidbar and Shavuos. But the points, the way they're described here in Hayim Beis, sound much more, they're coming from Tanya and Ageres HaKedesh and those discourses. With the Likutei Torah having somewhat different, there he talks Zemira more about singing the same song, and a little different explanation of the entire thing. I also want to add this whole context is also very related to something we learned earlier. Back in chapters 40s, we learned he brought the Segeres HaKedesh too. That's what reminded me. And there he spoke that there are, in the Makif, in the Pnimi, there is how Chachma and Bina, he spoke, how do they relate to existence or do they not relate to existence? Let me just go back there a moment. From the Maimer Yonaси, he brought this Tanya. Chapter, let's see, where is it? Okay, here we go. Chapter 47 and 48. So there, when he began discussing, it was at the end of the discussion of what after talking about immanent energy, he started talking about the transcendent energy. He said, Kol zeh b'chinas pnimi. That's the shir atzmei b'kayach. That's the 10 hidden spheres, how God envisions existence. And then he says, but it says gender. The transcendent energy does not come in Kelim, because it's a place that comes from Bligvul. It's only revealing the source. So basically, he made there a point that the entire 10 spheres are not applicable unless they're relating to existence. In a sense, what he's talking about here, how the Torah relates to existence. And he brings there at length, he talks about the whole thing, whether the spheres relate to existence, and he says that even Chachma and Bina, which says clearly in Pardes and other places that they are beyond existence, he says even they are also L'Tzeirach HaElemus. Okay, now why am I bringing this? Because then he goes on and says that what the Pardes says, that there also need for Elam is because there would be no wisdom and intelligence. If you remember, Atzilus is an interface, that without Atzilus you don't have understanding of God and you don't have a feeling for God. So in other words, not just the midas of Atzilus, but also the moichin of Atzilus, the intelligence of Atzilus is also for the world. Help us understand. So he says, so in other words, even Chachma and Bina, it says Kosovo part. It's like Kain Mispashtos Hamid Shem Mischakim Atzmusi v'Chachmosei Basogus Atzmusi Zbar Mismusi Kihu v'Chachmos Hakol Etzem Echad. So he says the Kavana is the Chachma Bina that encompassed the Ein Sof, and that's also necessary for the world. And there he brings V'yesh Leimer that this is what it says in the Geras HaKedesh that we just discussing here, that the Yediyas Atzmi, the way God knows the Torah within Himself, and says that too. That too ultimately is also for the purpose of existence. So basically, it's very related to what we're discussing. Because on one hand, David HaMelech focused on the outer dimension of the Torah. There's an inner dimension, how God knows the Torah. That would be what David HaMelech was punished for. He didn't focus on that. But at the end of the day, we're going to learn that even that part is also ultimately also going to be for the purpose of existence. However, it's removed from existence. That's what he discussed back there in chapter 47 and 48. That even that level, which is completely removed, how God, like what he says, He knows the Torah from within Himself. Why do you need that? Why does God need to know the Torah? Why does the Torah have to be a plaything, a shashriya melech batzmusei? God is beyond that as well, because that's the beginning of what will later become something also that will be related to us. So as we've discussed this already in the past, even though right now we're still focusing on that this part of the Torah is beyond us, but we started learning in chapter 174, the question is that he asked here, what did he say? In chapter 174, since this part of the Torah is only God, the light, the joy and delight and pleasure of the king, and the human being doesn't understand or appreciate this level, so why was David punished? So what's going to be the answer? Because we have to also relate to this level as well. So this level is also beyond us, but it doesn't mean we don't relate to it. So in other words, there's two things in Torah. There's one part in Torah that we relate to, like David HaMelech focused, and that's the part of Torah that relates to existence, that the whole existence is dependent on it, that it helps uproot the weeds. But then there's a level of Torah that does not give any credence or any tfisas makom, any value to us, but that's still important for us to relate to, and that creates the bittul in existence, total bittul. So it's not completely removed in the sense, it's removed from any type of relationship with us, and that's why David was punished. But at the end of the day, like we learned back then in chapter 47 and 48, that too is relevant to existence. It's relevant as far as negating existence. And that's what we're in the middle of discussing now. So he has the question, so why was he punished? So to answer this, he started saying we have to look at mitzvahs. That in mitzvahs we see that there's several levels of how a person does a mitzvah. And he went through a whole bunch of levels. Let's sum it up. Number one is Beis Inyanim in general. In general, two things in mitzvahs. Kavanos ha-mitzvah b'chinas hamshacha pratis. There's one mitzvah, the mitzvah is it breaks down in detail, like we're speaking about Torah as it relates to details. And for this we need to have a preface of love and awe and respect. And the kavanah is to know, say that Hashem Shabachol mitzvah, in every mitzvah, it has its particular transmission, its particular effect. And through that, we draw down the energy into that particular thing, whether it's tefillin, whether it's kashrus, whatever mitzvah it is. And what is the joy of a person in that mitzvah, in this level? The joy is I'm bringing down that dimension into, like he says, that he draws down the energy into his own spirit and also into the world. The bittul in this is a lower level of bittul. It's a bittul only in Giluyim. In general, in the Ratzon. And every desire, God wants this mitzvah, that mitzvah, so the bittul is to that particular desire. As we spoke, think of it, the job now is to dig wells. The king sends a messenger, dig wells. Or you go legislate something, or you go build something. So the involvement here is the Ratzon, the particular desire of the king, of the master in this case. And the Tzui is Einavek like L'Bchinas Ratzon. So here the simcha and the bittul, the joy, the bittul and the dedication is to the particular function of this particular desire. That would be, in other words, corresponding to how Torah applies to existence, what David focused on. What was lacking comes now. He's being the mitzvahs. The second thing in mitzvahs is kim mitzvah and savedis eved. The second is not focusing on the specific. You're a servant to fulfill the desire of God, and not in order to draw anything down. It's not about function. It has nothing to do with a function, not a function in illuminating your soul or the world. All it is, as he puts it, it's not not to draw down anything. That's not the intention. It draws down, but your dedication and bittul now is not relating to any benefit. I'm not talking about any personal gain. It's not talking about benefit. All you're focusing on is complete bittul to what the desire of God. And here the bittul is not in Giluyim to the Ratzon, not in the revelations of a particular desires, the desire Shabbos, Kashrus, the Tefillin, Karbonos or whatever. But here bittul is there, bittul insoif bal haratzon. Lasses kol mashul tzeni yizbarach. Even if he tells you to chop wood, it's also good. And chopping wood, if you use your intelligence, you know chopping wood, what does it draw down? Can you compare it to Pesach and to Yom Kippur and so on? So even though he doesn't mention here, it's similar to what he spoke a bunch of earlier. If you remember that alte shekel, a person shouldn't measure mitzvah kala and mitzvah chamura. So the Mishnah says clearly there is a mitzvah kala. There's a more lenient mitzvah. There's a more stringent mitzvah. You shouldn't be measuring because you'll be focusing on Bala Ratzon. From the point of view of the desire of the king, there's no difference whether you're chopping wood or whether you're putting on film. Not that the mitzvah is to chop wood. Your kavanah, however, is focusing on God's desire here, not on the specific detail. So the bittul is far deeper because the bittul is now to God on God's terms. So the Ratzon of a mitzvah in the specific of the specificities, the details of the mitzvah, is how God relates to the specific, which is also important. But then you want to know how God relates to the mitzvah from God's perspective. It's His Ratzon. And that's your bittul to the desire, to the Bal HaRatzon, to the one who desires, not to the actual desire. And then in this itself, he spoke two more levels. So generally we have two levels here. One is like prat, one is klal. One focuses on the specific function, the other one focuses on the source. Well, obviously all this is leading to that why David was punished, because you have to focus sometimes on the source of Torah. Not sometimes, you have to know that there's a source, the way the Torah is in the source. Yes, we will learn, as I mentioned before, that even the way God knows Torah and the way He learns Torah is also going to be important for us for existence. That's what we're discussing here. But you have to know that it's removed from you. Not about the function. What are the other levels that he speaks in this? So this is a bittul to balarot. Now in this itself, there could be several ways. Here's how he went to climb the ladder here. Okay. So first of all, let's start with, let me finish the point before we climb the ladder. And there's a simcha here, the joy here, and the bittul here, is not in the joy and the bittul because you're drawing down this energy in a particular way. Here the simcha is the joy that you fulfill the desire of God. Nachas ruach lefanai. You have joy because you had the schus to fulfill God's desire. Now come the other levels. So the first one, the joy, is that you drew down that energy into existence, you refined existence, you elevated existence, you elevate yourself, and so on. Here the focus is on purely the fact that you fulfilled God's desire. And again, this doesn't mean it doesn't have a function below. It's just a question of your dedication is far more complete. The interface is far more profound when you can relate to God on God's terms, not just God on the functionality of God's desires in existence. A person can stand in awe, for example, and look at nature and be in awe of the divine that manifests and that energizes existence. But that's how it manifests in nature. How does God see it? That's a different level of joy. That's a joy of how the source itself. You're not enjoying the composer's music, you're enjoying the composer himself. That you just don't, not only you know the psalm, you know the shepherd. And this itself, there's levels. The first level is, yes, you are not taking joy in the function, but in the source. But, what is the joy? The joy is that you had the schus, the merit to do it. So it's also a Veda Sevet, it's also a servant. But this pleasure here is not completely undiluted. It has one element. I am enjoying the fact that I was able to fulfill the divine desire. So yes, you're climbing to the divine, to the source, but there's still an I in there. Like he says, like a simple person, the king commands him to do something, and he serves him, so he has great joy that he had the merit to serve the king. A higher level, the simcha enig is just simply the fact that the desire of the divine desire was fulfilled. Not that you fulfilled it, not on the gavra that you fulfilled it, but on the actual fact itself. It was fulfilled. Which means even if someone else fulfilled it, would be the equal simcha. That's what I explained to just distinguish between. So even the first level is also on the divine, from the divine perspective, but now it's even deeper. So what we're seeing here is we're climbing into Shashua Melech Batzmusei, knowing how things from God's perspective can also have levels. The first level is to just enjoy the fact that you are fulfilling the divine desire. The higher level is that to enjoy the fact that the divine desire is being fulfilled. And then L'mayla Mizeh is even more. Because the second one is still not completely undiluted. Why? Because yes, there's no more I merited, that's not the point, but I enjoy the fact that the divine desire was fulfilled. And even higher, the third level in this second dimension is that his joy and his pleasure is in the mere fact is completely that the mere fact that the divine enjoys it becomes his joy. The bittul here is deeper because there's no self altogether. In the second level, Yes, it's not me that merited. Someone else could have done it as well. I enjoy it. I enjoy it because it's being fulfilled. But there's an eye watching, so to speak. The eye sees the desire fulfilled and therefore has great joy in it, even if you didn't merit it. No, it's not just about you meriting it. In this third level, there's no eye. You're so bottled that as soon as the source has joy and pleasure, you have joy and pleasure. It's not even a step. Oh, now I found out that the desire of the king was fulfilled, so I'm happy. It's so bottled that's like one extension. I am now an extension. The God's desire is fulfilled. I'm fulfilled, without even a step of two elements here. So it's not like you are one entity and you're having joy. You could have joy in other things. You're having joy because the desire of the divine desire was fulfilled. You're saying no. You're so bottled. I don't have any other joy except that. That would be another distinction. I said the distinction between level 1 and level 2 is level 1 says only if I fulfill it, I have the merit. Someone else fulfills it, I don't have the same joy. Again, he's not spelling that out, but I'm just giving an example. The second level says, no, I have joy as soon as the divine desire is fulfilled. But I have also other joys and simchas. I'm an entity, it happens to be. This is also something I'm bottled to. The third level is, you are nothing on your own. Your joy, period. And simcha is only from one thing. Simcha l'mayla is my simcha. That's where we stopped inside. But the bottom line is, all these three that I just described are all part of level 2 in the klal, so to speak, of the mitzvahs, not the prat that he began discussing. He still didn't conclude how it's in Torah, but it's clear where he's going with this. But we'll learn it inside now. So we began. And kavonas hamitzvahs b'chinas hamshacha klolis, so to speak. It's actually the word. It doesn't say klolos. So now we continue on the bottom of page 352. And the inyan in this is the inyan in this, explaining these two things that we just described. Basically, we described 4 levels, but really it's two categories, and the second category described the gradations as we go deeper and deeper. So now he's going back. I think Eifan Aleph he means here Eifan Aleph in the higher level already. Is apparent, it seems to me. But we'll soon see. Yeah, it seems so. In the Eifan Aleph, and I guess we'll go back, I'll make sure, but I think Eifan Aleph means the first way in the second dimension. We are not focusing on the function of the mitzvah, but you're focusing on this, the fact that God's will was fulfilled and desire was fulfilled. So in the first way, it's His pleasure, His joy, and His pleasure. And what constitutes His pleasure? His pleasure is comprised of what? From that there's nachas ruach l'mayla. Yeah, this is for sure that level, because we're not talking here its function in the nefesh or in the world. So level 1 in dimension 2, the higher dimension where we're talking now in the divine, from the perspective of the divine, the Baal HaRatzon, not the Ratzon, the Baal HaRatzon, the one who desires, not the desire itself. The joy and the pleasure is His, and what does He have pleasure in? In the fact that l'mayla, above, there's nachas ruach. God has a pleasure from this. So he says, now this is only from the bechein, from the so-called application, the result of the mitzvah, not from the mitzvah itself. So in this case, what is he enjoying? Not the mitzvah itself. He's enjoying the fact that the divine desire is fulfilled through this mitzvah. That's a bechein. It's a result of, it's an effect of. Where he's going with this, we'll see. Is this a quality or it's a negative? I'm not sure yet. In the parentheses he adds now, it's understood this is far higher and greater then the bechein, when we say bechein usually means, what's the bechein? What's the my benayim? Bechein means the result. The nafkim, how do we say bechein in English? But not just a conclusion. The result of, what's the outcome of our discussion? A pilpul. You have a pilpul, then you have the bechein, the result of. It's an outcome of. It's an outcome is the right word. So he's saying now, he's qualifying in the parentheses, it's understood that we're talking here an outcome that's far greater than higher than the outcome discussed elsewhere. Because the kan, gamma bechein hu etzem, in another parenthesis he says, because now we're talking the bechein is also the etzem. You see, in other places, when we talk bechein, we learned this before. Bechein is like when moichin contemplates on something and comes to a conclusion, this is a good thing to do. There, the bechein, the outcome, is is an outer dimension. It's so-called a lower dimension. Here, the bechein is the etzem itself. What's the bechein here? That God has pleasure from your doing a mitzvah. So he's just qualifying the word bechein. Don't confuse it with bechein that's stated elsewhere. That's all he's trying to say here. Here, the outcome means an outcome that is also part of the core. Because the outcome is not bechein of a mitzvah, for example, could be, I give somebody tzedakah, charity. What's the result? That person can go and support his family. That's an outcome going outward, going downward, so to speak. Here's the other way around. I do a mitzvah, and what's the bechein? That God has nachas ruach, that's going upwards. So he's just saying the outcome here is different than the outcome that's discussed elsewhere. So then why is he using that word? Because it's like the example, like a bechein, ke'inyan ha-bechein. It's similar to the idea of an outcome. In other words, it still has the same property of being an outcome, but he's talking here an outcome not as a so-called lower dimension. The outcome of a long, deep discussion comes into, okay, we're going to go and do a certain act. Here the outcome is going into the source, but it's still an outcome. That's just a qualification. That's Eifen Aleph. So the focus is not on the mitzvah, the focus is on the outcome, that the mitzvah causes pleasure to the king. So he's explaining, but in the second way, what was the second way? That it's not your pleasure that you merited to do it. I have to just make sure we're talking about the same. I just want to make sure something was there. I want to make sure which Eifen Aleph and Eifen Beis we're talking about here. So just give me a second. Okay, I'm going to have to analyze that afterwards. But Eifen Beis, in the second way, the pleasure is the pleasure above. It's not that you're having a joy out of the outcome of a mitzvah that's causing nachas ruach, pleasure above. The second level is actually the pleasure that's above. And what constitutes this pleasure? Be'etzem ha-mitzvah, in the core mitzvah. This is not the outcome of the mitzvah. Sheyesh le'tainug be'etzem ha-mitzvah, that he has pleasure in the actual performance of the mitzvah, the actual mitzvah. Hot on gishmak in the etzem mitzvah in dem is sameach mesanik. See, in the first level, being that there's an I that's involved, an I, and I'm not sure whether he means the I that has the merit of doing it, or he's the I that is enjoying the fact that God's desire was fulfilled. I'm not sure which way he's talking. I think it could be either way. I'm not sure yet. There, the focus is on the outcome. But when you're focusing on the einig shalamayla, that my einig, my pleasure is the pleasure above. What's the pleasure of above? The mitzvah itself, not its outcome. So you're not focusing on the result that God became happy, has pleasure from you doing it. You're focusing on the pleasure itself. And the pleasure is in the mitzvah itself. And therefore the geshmak of the person is an etzem mitzvah. In them is a sameach mesanik. In that he has joy and pleasure. Let's read on, because I don't want to conclude exactly which levels he's talking until I read the whole thing. Hagam she'eni yodea klal mahi ha-mitzvah. And even though he doesn't know at all, what is the mitzvah? Umau ataynik b'zeh. Though he doesn't, in other words, understand what is the mitzvah and what is the pleasure in it. In other words, it's not important here to understanding of it. Nevertheless, he has pleasure in the actual mitzvah, and that's only because the pleasure and joy above is whatever is the pleasure and joy above, that's his pleasure. It makes no difference. He sees the king has pleasure, that's his pleasure. It appears from this that Eifan Aleph and Eifan Abayz is the two higher levels. It seems so. But you could say Eifan Aleph is number 1 and 2 in the second dimension itself. A bit you could say that. I'm not positive, I think so. But you don't have to say that, because in Eifan Aleph, basically, because what do you have joy from? You have joy from the fact that the desire of the king was fulfilled, of God was fulfilled. So your joy is from the outcome of the mitzvah. You could apply that to whether also the first level, there's a, you know something? I want to just say something. 1 second. No, I'm mistaken. I would say he's going back to Eifan Aleph and Eifan Abayz, to the beginning of a whole discussion. After spelling out the 3 levels, he's saying now, let's now go back. Eifan Aleph, where you're focusing on what the mitzvah does to your soul or to the world. So there, you have simcha in the mitzvah. It's not clear to me, I'm not sure. But it's a simcha also from the outcome. Because the first level that we spoke about is also from the outcome. It's the function of the mitzvah, what it does. That's clearly what he said there. V'hainu, just let me read it again. Because he uses Eifan Aleph and Eifan Abayz on that. That's why the word Eifan Aleph, Eifan Abayz sounds like he's going back to the original. The thing is, however, it seems that the Eifan Aleph he's talking here can be applied, but subtly also to these 3 dimensions too. Sure. So I think maybe you could say it all. In general, the first way you're focusing on the function of the mitzvah, what it does, let's say, for example, tefillin binds your mind and the heart. So that's its outcome. It's not the mitzvah itself. The outcome is that. That is mamshech something, it's an outcome. Now, the problem is he says the outcome is the nachas ruach above. And the focus in the first way is not in the nachas ruach above, it's on the focus of the simcha of bringing it down. It says, Bezehu simcha, says the simcha is the simcha mamshech. He says, "Azeh simcha enek shalei b'kima mitzvah bittul bezehu rak begiluyim zoltzein v'mshul kol mitzvah bittul shalei." So who simchas nafshe begili eir haratzon? Okay, he could say there too. So then, what's his joy in the revelation of that particular desire? So it's essentially focus on the outcome of the mitzvah being of the mitzvah, not the mitzvah itself. In Eifan Abayz, let's say all 3 levels, the focus is not on what the mitzvah accomplishes. The focus is on, as he said, is the Bala Ratzon. In that itself, there are 3 levels. So the focus is on the source. The focus is on the source. The source wants a mitzvah. It's not the outcome what the mitzvah does. The source wants a mitzvah. However, subtly you can say that in the 3 levels in the second dimension itself, you could say the first one is a little more on the outcome, which is the nachas ruach that comes out of it, and the pleasure that you have that you merited to it. The second level is on the desire being fulfilled, again, somewhat you can say outcome. And the third, the highest dimension, that you completely, your pleasure is his pleasure is your pleasure, that has as the mitzvah itself. You may not understand the mitzvah as he said, but whatever he has pleasure, I have pleasure. Okay. It's an additional distinction. Till now the distinction was in the bittul, how deep is your bittul? Is there a self? Now he's saying, the bittul, on the other hand, the deeper the bittul, the more the focus is on the mitzvah itself and not on its peripheral on its so-called effects, whatever that effect may be, above or below. It's a very profound piece in Bittul and Naveda. You following?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So clearly, this Eif and Aleph and Beis, I would say go back to the first general Eif and Aleph and Beis, but I think you can apply it also to the subtle differences of these three levels. That's bottom line. In other words, the ultimate in level 2 is where his pleasure is your pleasure, is obviously the ultimate, where you see this bittul, where the focus is completely on the Etzem Mitzvah. Yeah. The lowest level is where you do the mitzvah for the Hamshacha, so that's the most so-called, he doesn't even mention ulterior motive, but it's not ulterior motive as much as really focusing on the outcome of something instead of the core experience. That's why the hiddur of a mitzvah, in other words, a person would perform mitzvah with much more diligence in this highest level than in the lower level. Because the lower level, it's mostly the outcome. So like you'll rush it and say, you know what? I got it done, now God has pleasure. Here, his pleasure is your pleasures. That means that mitzvah, the focus is on the core mitzvah, because that's the only way there's going to be full pleasure. There's no, like let's say learning. You're learning Torah. If you're learning Torah because it benefits or something to you, so you learn as much as you need to learn. Or if you're learning to give nachas ruach, as much as you need to give nachas ruach, you're not going to do it in the fullest sense of the word necessarily, because your focus is on its benefit. So as long as the benefit is fulfilled, when you have the bittul, that whatever his pleasure is the mitzvah. So then it has to be done in the fullest fashion for it to be completely pleasurable above, because there's no focus on self or benefits. I'm just adding another dimension to this. In other words, the deeper the bittul, the more the focus will be on actually doing a mitzvah exactly the way it is, because there's nothing else going on.
It's so involved.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Which would be, you could say, is counterintuitive. You can think, if his pleasure is my pleasure, so who really cares how the mitzvah is being done? No, but that's his pleasure, because there's no cheshbonus. You're not making any calculations. Good. I'm sure we'll understand this more as we learn further. And the example for this, the example for this is like a servant who does some function, who does some work for his master, Kamoi Kli. Like he builds a vessel, he's building a container, or Kahai Gavna, and similar. Shemahadir ba'hamalacha, shetia betachlis hanoi v'hayefi. So this servant, as he's building this container, or he's building this structure, he's mahadir ba'hamalacha. What does that mean? He beautifies. Mahadir, he works diligently, he's dedicated. How would you say mahadir ba'malacha? He's not just doing the work. He's mahadir. Mahadir means, ahidur means you're doing it with the best possible way. There's a word for it, mahadir ba'malacha. With total, he totally applies himself, total dedication, total... Shatiyah betachlis hanoi v'hayefi, that it should be in the ultimate beauty, ultimate what's the word for it? Ultimate perfection and beauty. V'yitiferes la'adam, and it should be something that the master is proud of, that the master enjoys. Now this diligence, this effort, this additional effort, this hidur, this care, you could say care, the care that he applies. He doesn't just do the work, he does it with special care. With special care to make sure it's the ultimate beauty and ultimate perfection. That should be beautiful. He says, this hidur b'nei v'yefi. Noi and Yefi are two words. Yefi means beauty. Noi is another form of beauty. Usually you can say, sometimes the difference you say Yefas Toya, Yefas Mara. So one is like beauty of, like the look is beautiful, and Noi is more the technical, the object itself is built in a very cohesive and efficient way. But Noi v'Yefi hadavar, how do you idea tainuk? The only way to be so careful in this beauty, in making something beautiful, is through pleasure. And specifically to the pleasure in the actual thing. Now he goes to parentheses for a number of lines. What he basically seems to be saying, that if you were just doing work, let's say you're a craftsman, and you're doing your craft because you've got to pay your bills, or whatever it may be, but you're not enjoying what you're doing, you're not going to build the most beautiful machine. Building the most beautiful machine requires an investment of pleasure in it. There has to be a pleasure element in it. So if you just take a robot, so technically you could build it right, but to make something with hidur, with particular care and concern, you'll see someone who doesn't have pleasure in something is not going to be care about it as much. A parent loves a child and will go the extra mile, the hidur, because there's a joy in it, there's a pleasure in it. And not just pleasure in general, it has to be pleasure in this object. So think of an artist who's not enjoying what he's building, or a composer not enjoying composing music, or an author, or someone, a craftsman building, doesn't have any pleasure in the thing. It's somewhere, it's not going to be the ultimate, it's not going to be the ultimate beautiful thing. And he goes in the long parentheses and explains. For example, a good craftsman, a good worker, a good craftsman, builds a object, a kli. Kli means a vessel, usually a container. It can be a machine. It can be anything that is. Kli is basically building something of some structure. Umahader b'malachte, and he's mahader. He's with diligence and care in his work. He's dedicated. When you say someone is really focused, not focused, mahader b'malachte. You know, when you go to you sometimes hear, when you hear referrals, they say two carpenters. They'll say this, but they're both good carpenters. This one really applies himself. He dedicates himself to what he does. You know, you say that you really can rely that he's going to do something to perfection. Why? Because he's dedicated. That's what mahadir means here. Mahadir b'malachte, and he's really care. He does his work with great care. Shetia b'tachlis hanei v'ayefi b'yesed. To be the ultimate beautiful and structure or in the cohesive structure. That's only because of the pleasure, the gishmak, which is hainu the gishmak. That means the joy. Gishmak in Tainug is the same thing, but in Yiddish, gishmak means like you really have pleasure that he has in the actual thing. Not only that he has pleasure in that it should be a nice object, and that he will be proud before others, which means this will be something that people will laud him. He will be lauded before human beings. It's like similar to the Mishnah that says, Perik Beis and Pirkei Avos, it says, Ezu derech sheyav min adam sheteferes lo yeteferes limina. Something that is beautiful in the eyes of people. So not only b'zeh tifarte, this will be the praise that people lefnei bnei adam. So the pleasure is not just that it's beautiful, and not just that he will appear beautiful and praised by others. The bezel levad ein le gishmak be'etzem hadavar. In this alone, he does not have pleasure in the actual making the object. The bezel levad. I'm sorry. Let me re-sing it. The bezel levad. This alone, if he only had pleasure in the thing that is beautiful, or that people will praise him for the awards that he will get, and the praise and the commendations he will receive. Ein le gishmak be'etzem hadavar. The bezel levad. In this alone, and he doesn't have, if he only has pleasure in these two peripheral elements, the outcomes. That's the whole point here, the outcome. And not in the actual thing, lo yahid b'peil. He will not have that care, and it will not be as beautiful in actuality. So if he has only joy in the outcome, that this is a nice object, and that he's praised for it, and so on, and he doesn't have gishmak in the actual thing, it won't be hidden. Only when he has a tuf tam, which means a good taste, and gishmak. He's a real expert, and really takes pride in creating a exemplary product. I think kli would be a good word, product, to build a product for the master. And he takes real joy in creating an exemplary, a top quality product. Through this will be the hidur. He'll make sure to do it to perfection. And the beauty then, and the praise, and everything that comes out of it will come automatically. Because he's not focusing on the result. Remember, the result, then it's only as much as the result requires. He's focusing because he's a fundamental professional. He's actually has joy and pleasure and is an expert in what he's doing. This is an example, and the moral is the same thing as by Eved. The hidur, his diligence and care, is not just in teferes, the pride that the Adam will have, the master will have, but because of the good taste and the energy that he has from the actual work. To do it diligent, to dedicate himself, to apply himself and do it with a great care and concern and dedication, with all his potential, with all his power, that it should be the ultimate beautiful object or beautiful product. So what do we see here? We see two types of pleasure. One is from the peripheral. One is from the outcome, from the bechein, as he put it before. That something comes out of it, but that's not going to have the ultimate beauty. If you want it to be the ultimate beauty, you have to apply yourself, you have to have dedication to the thing itself. All this is coming to explain the difference between those two levels of how he said whether the einig is in the pleasure, is in the outcome of the mitzvah, or it's in the actual mitzvah. But now he's going to qualify. So this example is good to explain how the pleasure is in the actual work and not just in the outcome of the work. Not even just the beauty of the work, but the actual work. He loves it and enjoys it, and therefore will do the best, and automatically it'll be ultimate beauty. But here we got a big question. We said the Eved doesn't have his own. We're talking about it's all the pleasure of the king, of the melech, of the master. So he's qualifying. So he says, if you're dealing in the example, you go to hire someone to build you a beautiful home, a beautiful piece of art, a beautiful product. There, he's not. There, his dedication. He creates perfection. He loves what he does. He has pleasure in that. Here we have to go back. The Eved, on the other hand, his whole pleasure and energy and life, the only reason he has pleasure is because the pleasure and the life and the energy of the master is his pleasure. Because a servant on his own, a servant on his own is completely beyond and below. Is infinitely distant from any energy, v'tainug, and pleasure in any work. Also, that there should be betachas hechsher, including that they should be the ultimate perfection, or the ultimate how would you say hechsher here? The ultimate perfection, the ultimate perfection. Why? Because his skill, his talents, his chushim, his instincts, his abilities are not that subtle. The einam chushim ufshotim, and they're not abstract senses or chushim is also talents. His talents are not that abstract. That he should know and feel the pleasure in this like the master feels it. The master whose senses and talents and skills are subtle and abstract. And the master knows the quality of the object, or the product, and how that it's a fundamentally the object of pleasure. The servant is not capable of knowing and feeling the thing. Rather, that the pleasure of the master is his pleasure. This complicates matters, obviously. Because we just said that if a person does not apply himself directly to the object and has pleasure in the thing itself, he can't really create the ultimate beautiful product. And now we're saying there is no person, and that he doesn't even appreciate really the object and all its dimensions. So, answer is because he's introducing the bittul of an eved is so profound that he actually becomes an extension of the adon. He's so bottle, and this is something to the master. This is something that needs to be qualified because we don't relate to such type of subjugation. We actually are repulsed by this type of. This almost sounds like a slave that has no mind and heart of his own. But you have to remember that we're not talking here in the physical. This is all an example to understand total bittul. So let's think of it like this. Let's say a person with God, which is of course the moral here. What's the story? The story is like this. We come to realize that we're so infinitely distant from the divine. And we don't therefore value even our qualities. We realize we cannot fully appreciate the subtlety and, as he says, the abstraction of a very true, something that's true. We relate to materialism. You start learning Chassidus and you start learning about something that's spiritual, you realize I'm very far from that. So then you can say, okay, so then I'll do things with Kabbalah Sale, I'm bottle, and I'll just do it. But there's a level, that's a level where we talk about an Eved, that's an Eved that basically realizes his lowliness, comes to dedicate himself to something greater than himself. The ultimate bittul and interface is that not just that you do it as a job, that you actually assume, you learn so much and assume the property, you integrate rather so much the Adon's perspective, that you become completely bottled. Whatever the Adon has pleasure in, you have pleasure in. So the example he gave before about the craftsman who's producing a beautiful product, that part of the example is only to show that you have to have complete pleasure in it, or else you can't create beauty. Where that pleasure comes from is very different. By a craftsman, it comes because he's an expert, and he's a yesh actually. By a beved, it comes because he's an extension of the pleasure of the king, so he will apply himself completely to build this product in the most beautiful way, just like the other craftsmen. So the distinction here is only from whence does this pleasure come from. So by the example by the Oman, the worker that he gave, that's why it's an example. It's not exactly. There, the example is only to teach us that you need to be involved in have pleasure in the thing itself, or else you will not create something of perfection. In the Eved, that pleasure comes from the king, from the master, from the king. So you could have an Eved also who is not so bottled. He's just going to do whatever you want me to do. You want me to go build you a product? I'll build you a product. But then there's an Eved that is so bottled so subjugated to the master that he's like an extension of the master. He doesn't understand the master's chushim. As he says, he's beyond himself. But he is now so bottled, he becomes like the arms and legs, like the ultimate shliach of the Mishaleach, and it makes no difference whether he has qualities or not. And therefore he assumes the same pleasure as if the master himself was building it. That's what he's adding here. So it's a harder dimension to understand, because in the craftsman it's understood. We see this all the time. You hire people who are experts. You see they love their work. They love what they do. They dedicate themselves, and they will not give you a product that is below par. Not because you may not award them or they won't get praise, because they have actual pleasure in creating a perfect product. But there the motivation is more because that's who they are. Here, the Eved whereas let's take another craftsman who's not like that to that extent. He wants to be praised. He has pleasure in the beauty of it. He's not as pleasure in the object itself, so then he's not going to create something of such beauty and perfection. In the Eved, the only difference is the same thing. You can have an Eved that's like the second workman, craftsman who's not dedicated completely, but you have an Eved that is so part of the king, and he knows that the Melech and the Adon wants this thing, that he actually assumes the properties of that pleasure. He doesn't understand it, like he said all the way at the top of the page with the mitzvah. Sheni de'eklal mahi mitzvah ma'u ataynik. It doesn't understand, but he's so dedicated to the master that his pleasure becomes my pleasure, and therefore it's as if he's actually has pleasure in the in creating the object itself, even though he himself doesn't have such chushim, such skills on his own. So needs a little more explanation, but that's the point that he wants to make here, which may explain why the whole example was in a parentheses, because to just show that we're not talking about exactly the same thing. It's an example. Because if you look, you'll see, first it says the mashal, look, he says, a mashal, that was right away bothered me. In top 5th line, he says, the example to this, to understand the pleasure that you have not from the peripheral, not from the outcome of the mitzvah, but from the mitzvah itself, is like an eved who's doing a work for his master, to do it perfection. Then he says, the parentheses as a second mashal, which is only an example, not for the etzem concept we're speaking about here, which is only by a servant. It's to explain the element that you have to have pleasure in the thing itself. So we have to qualify this mashal in the parentheses is only about the idea of complete investment in the object itself. Not, however, the idea that the craftsman is actually the opposite of an eved. Because his pleasure is not because he's dedicated, it's because he himself is just he loves his work. Actually, you'd say it's the opposite of an eved, it's the ultimate of a yesh in a way. I mean, it's not relevant here because he's not trying to focus on the yesh. He's just not. I think that's the way to learn it. And then after the parentheses, he goes back. So by a servant, however, the einik comes because it's the king's einik. In other words, basically, only an eved can get beyond his own limitations and actually create a beautiful product simply because he's so bottled to another. In other words, you see what I'm saying? If you want to have a perfect craftsman, you have to find a professional who's trained, who's done it many years. And you want his chushim not to be subpar. You want his skills and his senses to be very, very refined and subtle and abstract. With an eved, the twist goes like this: he doesn't have to have such chushim. As long as he has complete bittul, he becomes an extension of the king, of the melech's, of the master's chushim, the master's skills and senses and pleasure. So it's an interesting twist. So this type of eved could create as good a product as a professional because of his complete dedication. I'm not talking now of the actual skill. Obviously, he's not going to send an eved to build a cabinet who doesn't have the skill. We're talking about, however, his investment in doing the pleasure is not because he wants to create a beautiful product, not because he is a professional in this skill, it's because the king wants him to do so. So his complete skills are completely dedicated. The problem is that when he says the chushim, meaning the appreciation, you have to say that he has to have the hands for it. Because an eved, no matter how much bittul he has, he can't do something that he's not capable of. You can't have an eved, no matter how much bittul, he can't play violin if you never learned violin. So you clearly have to say he's skilled. However, his senses are not as refined as the masters are.
Nevertheless, he's able to feel the master's geschmack.
Geschmack. That's the point, the geschmack. But I'm focusing now on the chushim, not on the geschmack.
Right.
The chushim.
Even though he doesn't have great chushim, he can't inside himself produce pleasure. But he has enough.
Yeah, for the pleasure part, I understand. He's getting the pleasure from the master's. The master's pleasure is channeling through him as he applies himself to the work.
That's what I'm asking.
But his chushim are, he says, clearly inferior.
If he doesn't have chushim, how can he feel the master's pleasure? That's kind of the question.
No, because he could have total bittul. If he has total bittul, then he becomes just an extension. It doesn't matter. The problem I'm having is like this: how could he actually even build a product without any skill? He has to have skill.
He must be a great craftsman.
Or crafts. Well, but then what means his chushim are weak?
His sensory for something?
No, so you could say meaning he means referring to the pleasure in it. His chushim are weak is pleasure part. That's what you have to say, he says. That the chushim here is really not about the skill to build it, but more the pleasure, because he doesn't really appreciate this type of subtle thing. It's a little complicated, because how could he build that? Let's use an example. What is this eved making for the master? let's say he has to build for him a piano. If his skills are subpar, he cannot be assuming the king's skills, the master's skills. He could assume the master's pleasure. He could say, I have no pleasure. The master has pleasure? You have to say that he must be very skilled. But the pleasure that he's getting in doing it is not because he's a master, but because his master has pleasure in it. But then there's still a problem, because you say, chushim shlei einim dakim. Einim dakim einim chushim ufshat mishiyada v'yargish einik shebezeh. I'm wondering where would this apply? What thing you're suggesting a person who does not have on his own the skills or the senses, but because the master has pleasure, he has pleasure. But we're talking here also practical skill. I mean, let's talk an example. A master craftsman who builds pianos or builds violins or an artist.
Right.
The Eved, no way that he can learn that just because he's buttled to the king, to the master. So what is it that... It's a question I have. I'm not clear. You know what? We'll move on. I'll think about it. I have to think about it.
I'm not sure why he must be, even though you have a question.
How does he do it then? He has to,
he's doing something perhaps very simple. The king wants some very simple tasks.
But I want to use an example that's not so simple.
I understand.
If it's simple, then you don't have a problem. Then there's what it means, tachlis hayefi, a simple task with ultimate beauty. You're clearly showing the example. You're talking about a craft that has need to have hidur. You're talking about bringing him a plate of food. I understand what you're saying.
But that Tachlis Hayofi is giving us the example of the Uman, that he's fully involved in the Etzim.
Right, so how is that applied to the Eved Tachlis Hayefi?
That part doesn't apply to the Eved at all.
But he does. Go before the parentheses and you'll see he does. Kamekli. Then that's my problem. He clearly is talking about something that's more than just a menial labor. We're not talking about making the bed. Okay, that's a question, fine. The question needs to be thought about. Fine, it's all right. We're allowed to, this is the point, he's trying to understand Ayin Beis. He said, Hine ahidu b'nevi yifet ayadeh tainik, v'davka tainik be'etzem ha'davar. I mean, I understand what he's saying. For example, let's go back to the violin, building a violin. I'm just using that because it's an intricate piece of work, or a piece of carpentry, whatever. I understand that the Eved may not have the appreciation into the real pleasure of what this craft is. Let's for argument's sake that's the case. And that his theory has chushim. His chushim are not subtle, not as subtle, and not as abstract, like the master's. But because he's doing it with such dedication to the master, he's able to apply that type of energy into it. But you have to have the skill to build it. There's no way that he doesn't know how to build it. So you have to say that he's a type of person that is almost like a slave, or a person growing up in a very lowly environment who was taught a skill that he himself does not really appreciate all its depth. So technically he can do it. And where does the pleasure come from? The things that he doesn't appreciate, that's coming because of his master. That's what you have to say, that he must have the hands for it. Except you have to say he's not a craftsman like a real professional who has, like an example of a person who completely has on his own that type of pleasure. In other words, it's almost like you have in palaces, you have servants who are masters. They're masters of all kinds of things. They grew up in servitude and they learn skills. So they never really appreciate the skill quite like their superiors, but they do have the skill. That's what you have to say. But it means you have to say that this person has fundamentally inferior instincts and inferior senses. I understand that in the Nimshal is very fine. I can understand that in the Nimshal. Let's use the moral, okay? Here's the moral. You listening? Yeah. In the moral you can understand it. I understand it above. We're infinitely distant than God. We come to realize that our greatest instincts are non-abstract and are not subtle compared to, let's say, the chushim of Atzilus or of a big tzaddik. Okay. However, we do have skills. We do know, like by the Mishkan, it says everyone did their thing. This one came and sewed, this one knitted, this one this. The malacha, each one does. So I have my skill, let's say my skill is at writing. But I know my writing, I can't really express the depth of spirituality as it is in Ak, or in Atzilus, or in Bria. But I can write, so I take my pen and I write. So how do I get now? If I was invested in, if we're talking about something on the level of the world, so like the Uman, an example of the parentheses. So my pleasure is because I enjoy creating something, I enjoy what I'm doing. Therefore, it'll be a beautiful product. But if I'm doing something that is beyond me, I'm trying to write and convey something that's completely on a different level, I don't have the chushim for that. So where am I going to get the pleasure that's necessary to make it beautiful? So in this case, if you're bottled completely to your master, who does have the chushim to appreciate that depth of the, then your skill in writing, which till now was an inferior skill compared to that, becomes a channel to convey a far deeper spirituality that you yourself could never have conveyed on your own because of your bit.
Becomes completely, yeah, exactly.
So in the Nimshal I understand it. It's harder for me to understand in the Mashal. Because this is because we're talking Ruchnius. Where in the Mashal can you have, let's say, a servant who doesn't appreciate what? The subtlety of creating a piece of carpentry as much as the master does. See, I don't see in the Mashal. It's harder for me to understand it in the physical world because we're talking about physical skills.
I don't think it's such an unusual idea.
In the Nimshal, you understand, the Nimshal I have no problem for the reason I just said.
Itself, I don't think it's so unusual to have a Metzia where you find somebody very skilled and he doesn't appreciate the impact that he's doing. That's not such an unusual
Okay. So either in the Mashal you can have, so you could have a craftsman that does appreciate what he's doing.
That's an excellent job.
But
he doesn't have a global view.
Oh no, one second. I'm talking about someone that does. It's talking about in the Mashal, in the parentheses.
The Mashal, he's very good.
Yeah. Now someone that has it and can create perfection.
And he's very given over.
Right. That's that type. But then there's a person who may not be. So he gets that level of that higher level from his bittul to the master.
As you say many times, he doesn't have.
But I would like to have I hear what you're saying theoretically, but can you give me an example of it?
I think it's so common.
People are very skilled, but they don't.
They don't know the impact. If they have their own point of view, they would just be a different person.
Okay, fine.
The king sees everything in his tremendous breadth, idea, depth.
Okay.
And so this person,
I'm fine with this.
is a different person completely.
Fine with this.
But again, that's what he's saying. That he doesn't understand.
Right, he doesn't understand. That's what he says.
Yeah.
Okay. I think so. We're getting somewhere. Listen, it needs more thought, but it's we got something. Yeah. Ki ima shataynik shaloi odnu hataynik shaloi. What do we have?
1040. Cards on the wrong side.
Okay. Avla Eved. Okay. So here we go. So being that the pleasure of the master is his pleasure, that's why he can do it. And that's because he puts himself aside. He puts his core aside. He's not in existence on his own at all. His entire existence is only the master's existence. And that's where the pleasure of the master is completely his pleasure. And that's his life, that's his sustenance, that's his energy. Und das meint man be'em if chushahider b'nevi yefi amalacha. This parentheses may answer what we're discussing. So he adds in Yiddish, und das meint man, that's what is demanded of him.
That brings it out. Mont, oif, brings out.
Das meint man be'em, not meant of. This is what is expected of him. This is what is demanded of him.
Okay.
Das meint man und das meint be'em oif. No.
Even our craft.
No. I have to read. I have to retranslate. Und das meint be'em oif. This calls up from him. This elicits from him. Chush hahida b'nevi yefi amalacha. The chush, the sense of beauty, of hider, of care, of perfection, in the beauty and the cohesiveness of the product of the work. Mm-hmm. So he's actually what he's saying here is that this complete dedication is eliciting from him skills that he himself would not have had on his own.
Yeah. Brings it out.
But what we're talking about, yeah.
Sure.
So bittul can. Now again, if he didn't have any hands, we're not saying someone who doesn't even know how to put together a violin is not going to be able to do this. Okay. It's just you're saying he has the hand skills for it, but he may not have the full appreciation of the whole dimension.
And he may even have the craftsman's deep geschmack. But the craftsman Shmak is just in making an instrument. He doesn't have the Adon's other
Okay, yeah, okay, fine. So now he goes back to the nimshal. Mitzvah is the same thing as in mitzvah. The pleasure above is the pleasure below. Is his pleasure. So not that he has out of the result of it, that he has pleasure and joy from the actual chayis. He has life and energy and pleasure in the actual mitzvah. Even though he doesn't at all know the quality and the value of the mitzvah. However, because of his core subjugation, core selflessness, core suspension of self, la'atzmus ein sof, to the core of ein sof, of godliness, she'enim mitzias la'atzmei, that he's not in existence on his own, that he does not in any way feel himself as an independent existence, mishum zeh yesh lechayis ve'enig be'etzem ba'mitzvah, she'zeh ha'tainik shel ha'mayla. Because of that he has life, he has, vitality. That's what I would say. Vitality, pleasure in the actual mitzvah, because this is the pleasure above. V'hu chai b'zeh, and he lives in it, b'chinas chayis atzmi, in a core fundamental vitality. Leidak b'chinas chayis hamispashet, not just a life that extends. In other words, a life that extends is usually something that's more external, that's giving life to something. Ki b'chinas chayis atzmi mamash. Chayis hamispashet refers to, like, the product of life. But the actual core life, chayis atzmi mamish. To explain this a little more, what chayim is about. I think we should stop here, because he's going to go now into the concept of Torah. Yeah, I don't want to. It's going to be a whole.
Say something for Sunday.
Fine. It's all right. I have to go over it anyway. No, because I see it's going into a bunch of new details. Okay. I mean, I see that he's going to. I think we have to register this. So therefore, this is the higher level. Let me just conclude the higher level of where the pleasure above is your pleasure. So it's in the actual mitzvah, not in the peripheral. It's not in the periphery, not in the outcome of the mitzvah. It's the actual item. So number one is that it's complete bittul to the source. Number two, that is the actual mitzvah. Yeah. So it's not about me and the benefit. It's not even what I merited. It's the complete bittul to that. So it's also complete. It's a complete bittul to the source, and therefore completely dedicated to the pleasures in the mitzvah itself, not in the results of it. It's total transformation. You're taking someone who becomes a complete channel, it's a complete interface. He is now an extension of the highest form of skills, simply because of his total bittul. Okay, we'll stop here. So we did sex part 2 in chapter 174, pages 352 and middle of 353.